Here we are. Yes, this is the NLP Society in Sweden, and it is in God's date of the 21st of April 2020 in Corona times, and we're welcoming people joining this webinar with Dianne Lowther. And it's going to be fun. It's going to be exciting. We're going to learn a lot of stuff. And Dianne she's a master trainer of NLP, loads of experience, and she's written, among other things, a book called NLP for Work, the Practical Guide. So I'm going to leave this over to Kristina Berglund in our styrelse, as we say in the branch. And she will tell you in Swedish how come Dianne is here. Varsågod, Kristina.
Tack. Ja, det är jättespännande. Det här har jag sett fram emot länge. Diana träffade jag på för ett antal år sedan. Jag kommer inte ihåg hur länge och på vilket sätt. Men det resulterade i att jag köpte en webbutbildning av henne. Och som var riktade, man kunde välja då om man var practitioner, master eller trainer. Och det innehöll olika saker. Och jag insåg att det här var hennes sätt att presentera utbildningarna, om materialet hon la in, videosnuttarna, träningen. Alltså den var så bra. Klar, tydlig. Så den tycker jag väldigt mycket om. Och sen så har jag följt henne under alla år därefter. Och jag är jätteglad att hon accepterade och tyckte att det skulle vara spännande att vara med på ett webbinar för oss i föreningen. Så att vi får lyssna på henne och hennes väldigt fina förmåga. Så att ja, det var den introduktion jag tänkte säga bara om Dianne. För att hon får berätta mer om sig själv och vad hon gör. Och ja, därmed lämnar jag vidare ordet.
Perfect. Och då tänkte jag bara säga that was a great presentation, just so you know it, Dianne.
I'm relieved to hear that.
So,
thank you, Kristina.
So what we're going to do now, we're just going to welcome some more people who have joined us and just tell you that, well, this is Dianne Lowther and we're doing the webinar. And as usual, you can at any time unmute yourself or write a question in the chat if you want, and we can read it out, or you can wave your hand and be polite, or you can barge in and just be yourself or whatever. That's fine. But we're going to start with Jenny, because we were talking before and she had a great take on what we would like to ask Dianne.
Yes, I had the pleasure to do sort of a brief presentation on our website for you and for this webinar. And I noticed that you work in quite a lot of different areas, from the tech industry to police to healthcare. And I was just wondering, is there any common approach from NLP that you use sort of more not so contextually?
Mm-hmm.
Do you understand the question?
I do,
yeah?
yes. Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I have been asked before, you know, so if I work with police officers and I work with IT people, how come I then also go and work with people in hotels or healthcare or that kind of thing? And I think the reason why I'm able to work in lots of different contexts is because fundamentally NLP is about structure rather than content. And so if we chunk way up, really what I do and what my business does is we help people to interact more successfully with the other people around them at work. And so that idea goes across so many contexts. So what it really means in lots of cases is that for each person it means something different. So you could be a leader in an organization and you want to be more successful in the way that you lead your team. Or you could be a salesperson and you want to be more successful in the way that you serve your customers. Or you could be chief executive of a business and so on. But all of us has to interact with other people as part of our work. And so that really is the common theme that goes across all of those different contexts in which I've run NLP training programs.
Thank you.
That's interesting. When we were talking earlier, chatting with a mail, you and one thing I've seen you been doing You've been a part of what's called NLP Leadership Summit.
That's right.
And can you explain for us what that is and a little bit about it?
Yes. So the NLP Leadership Summit was the idea of Michael Hall, who is a US NLP trainer. His company is Neurosemantics. And what used to happen is that the NLP conference in London used to be quite a meeting place for lots of well-known NLP trainers. So quite often Robert Dilts would be there. A lot of the well-established UK trainers would be there, people like John McWhirter and Ian McDermott and so on. People would come from lots of different countries. And there was always a little room set aside just for the presenters. And I think Michael, he would tell the story better than me, but Michael had the idea that there were people from lots of different schools of NLP represented at that conference, and they would enjoy chatting to each other over lunch, and then they'd all go back to their own little bit of the world. And one of the issues we have in the UK, I don't know how it is here in Sweden, is that there are lots of different schools of NLP, different associations that issue certificates and so on. And sometimes potential customers accuse us of not really being a good example of what we teach, in that, you know, it's well known that some of the very early trainers of NLP now don't speak to each other and don't get on and so on. And so Michael formed the idea that if the NLP field as a whole was going to have a future and wasn't just going to get fragmented and diluted and, you know, disappear, that it needed some leadership. And he felt that we'd gone beyond the point of Bandler and Grinder being the leaders of the field, in that, you know, they have moved on and are no longer kind of doing what many of us do. So Michael said, well, what would it be like if we just had a meeting and talked? And he's always been very clear that the purpose of the Leadership Summit is for leaders in the field of NLP to associate with each other, and with no agenda. There was never any intention that we would form a new association, or we would create new standards or anything like that. It was always just, let's just talk to each other, get to know each other, and share our ideas. And there's probably about 4 meetings at the NLP conference in London. So every year, you know, we would get together for an hour or 2 hours, and people would then start to say, okay, well, this is nice, but what are we going to do? And so we formed the idea, I can't remember where it came from, that we would actually have a longer meeting. And so 4 years ago, we had the first Leadership Summit colloquium, which is a kind of interesting word for a sort of conference meeting, which was held in Spain.
What does colloquium mean?
Sorry?
What does colloquium mean?
It kind of means a meeting of minds.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a word I've not really seen used anywhere else, but Michael is the master of language, so he came up with this. And I didn't go to the very first meeting. There were only about 20 people at that one, but some of the people who I knew who had been said it had been a really interesting and enjoyable experience. So 2 years ago, when they did the second one, I went along, and I personally had a really good time. Really enjoyed meeting. There was 70 NLP trainers from around the world. And in order to join the NLP Leadership Summit, you have to meet all the criteria. And the principal one is you have to have been teaching NLP for at least 15 years. And so I met some of my heroes, you know, people that you've seen their name on the cover of books, you know, and here they are talking about 40 years on, you know, what they're doing with NLP, which was fascinating. And I think what we saw at the meeting in January of 2020 was, I think the atmosphere had changed slightly, in that people do now know each other, and those differences in the way that people promote NLP, the way they teach NLP, some of the differences in the standards between countries and different schools of NLP, they've ceased to be a source of conflict, and they're now becoming a source of interest. So I think 6 years ago, you wouldn't have said to somebody else in the Leadership Summit, so, you know, how do you assess your students? Because people would have been sensitive to that, and, you know, do you think there's something wrong with the way I do it? But we had a great session in January of this year, which was based on the open space principles, and it was facilitated by the team from Austria, headed by Uli. And we had the opportunity to talk about whatever was of interest. And I hosted a session which was about how do people teach certain elements of NLP? Because we'd found that we'd spent a lot of time talking about the future of NLP as a field, and about professional standards and the credibility that comes from publishing research and so on. And I went to that meeting in January, and my intention for myself was that I wanted to just talk NLP with some of the people that I knew there. And so that's what we did. And we had a couple of hours session where I said to people, okay, so tell me how you teach the meta model, for example. And it was great just hearing the different ways that people do it. And of course, even, you know, within people who've been teaching NLP for a long time, everybody has their own favorite sessions. They have their own different audiences, and therefore people are interested in things for a different reason, so they put a different slant on it. So we had a very rich and interesting conversation about how we would teach various different aspects of NLP. And as a result of that, we're going to start putting together some materials. I was brave or foolish enough to put my hand up and say I will start collating and curating lots of different trainers' contributions on this. So that's quite a big project for me, but I think it's going to be a very interesting one.
And the result, where is it intended to be projected?
The collation of all that how do you teach stuff, it'll come out eventually as a book. And the first topic I'm looking at is how do we teach the meta model. But, you know, people are saying, oh, but why don't we do, you know, how do you teach anchoring? How do you teach, you know, so many different things. So if the first one goes well, there could be a number of them. Yeah.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So that will be one book. Are you thinking to go further and take another way to teach, or another subject?
Another subject, yes. Yeah. So this first one, I've had contributions so far from probably, maybe 10 or 12 different NLP trainers, including Michael Hall and Robert Dilts. And they're really sharing, you know, this is the behind the scenes, this is how I teach this subject. So I think it will be a great resource for NLP trainers all over the world when it's done.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
And any question about that leadership summit? Anyone have that? No?
The other thing you might be interested to know is that the Leadership Summit is also now looking at how to build bridges between the different associations around the world. And so, you know, you may get some news about that coming out later this year. I'm not part of that team, but there is quite a dedicated team working on looking at how do you build the bridges and get some kind of common agendas across all the different associations for NLP. So that
Has there been any suggestions of what a common agenda might be?
I think it's about being able to share what works and what doesn't work, and where there are, for example, research projects being published in one country, being able to give access to that elsewhere, so we all benefit from everything that's being done. Yeah, and there was talk about developing common standards for training, but I think, you know, we've sort of put that on the too difficult pile for the moment.
Yeah, we've been discussing that because we have it. I mean, we're a non-profit, and our mission and vision is to spread information. We are supposed to be a place where people interested in NLP can meet, discuss, gather experience, bring people, voices from the outside, like you now, into the pool. We don't take sides with any particular school, or and when people ask us, how should I learn NLP? We tell them that, you know, it's something that you preferably learn together with a group of people, because it's about different perspectives. It's not something that you read in a book about. It's like dancing tango. You cannot dance tango from a book. You have to do it with somebody. But at the same time, people keep asking these things. And when the discussion about standards comes up, it's a tricky one to answer, because who is to say what is quality in this case?
Yes, yeah. And the NLP Leadership Summit has a sort of a definition of quality NLP, which, again, we're not in total agreement about, because at the moment it focuses mostly on the length of training. And, you know, we're very well aware of the limitations of that, because if something is not being very well done, somebody could spend a lot of time going through a training program and still not reach a good standard of proficiency.
Exactly.
Whereas a good trainer might need less time to get people up to the right standard. So that's a big conversation, but it's one that we're kind of continuing to have in the Leadership Summit.
So on the other side of that, there would be the question, how do you assess your students? Because if you want to find a standard, you need to have some way to measure it, right?
Absolutely, yes. And personally, and I don't speak for the Leadership Summit in this, I think that what would be really useful would be to have a common set of assessment criteria, so that we could say we're all agreed that if somebody is assessed against these criteria and succeeds, then we can say that they're an NLP practitioner, rather than saying they have to have trained for a certain amount of time, for example.
Gaffa has a question. Gaffa, I think you could unmic yourself and ask it. It becomes more dynamic.
Yeah, no problem. Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Interesting when you spoke about this, how to teach the meta model. And I was just wondering, when you did that in this summit, leadership summit, how did you do that practically? Did you have like one day, okay, now I'm going to teach you the meta model, and then someone else teach the meta model, or how did you do it practically?
It was just one element of a day where there were probably about 20 different discussion groups going on across the day. So I had about 12 people in that discussion, and we literally just went around the table and gave everybody 5 minutes to talk about one of the ways that they make sure that that particular session works well. So some people shared exercises, a couple of people talked about how they would set up the whole session, a couple of people talked about how they help people remember things, and so on. So people contributed in different ways.
Okay. So more or less chopped it up to different parts of the recipe.
That's right. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Instead of
so we didn't get the whole recipe from anyone.
Not the whole NLP meta model menu. No. Okay. No. Okay. Thank you. Thanks.
You're welcome.
You told you were working with the police and in the area of medical, what you said, medicals. Can you tell me a little bit about it? What is this an NLP, train them NLP, what it is and how they should think, or is it the communication with other people? Can you explain a little bit more?
So my introduction to working with police officers was with my local police force. One of the high-ranking officers came on a practitioner training where I was assistant trainer, and he wanted to take NLP back into the force, and the lead trainer on the program, it was his business, he wasn't willing to work at the kind of fees that the police service can afford to pay. So I said I would do it, and we did a full practitioner training. So it was a complete training program just for one unit. So we had people at sort of 4 or 5 different ranks, but they worked together and they knew each other. And the frame for that was really, it was about leadership. So they came on the program thinking they were going to learn NLP to help them become better leaders as police officers. And it was really interesting because what actually happened is that, of course, they got that, but they also found lots of applications of what they were learning in the operational police work. And some of my favorite examples of what they did are more to do with the operational police work than they are to do with their leadership roles. May I tell you a story?
Yeah, please.
Yes.
Yeah. So there was a police sergeant, a woman, not very tall, not very heavily built. She was quite small. And she came back to about the 3rd module, and she said to me, this thing about matching behavior, she said, to create rapport. She said, how does that work? For example, when I'm in the cell block on a Saturday night and we've got somebody locked up who's drunk and noisy, and he's hammering on the cell door and shouting, let me out, let me out. So I thought, okay, well, I've never been in the cell block of a police station, so this is way outside of my area of expertise. But NLP is about structure. So I said to her, well, let's think about it. What does the theory say? If you want to change somebody's behavior, what do? You pace and lead. So you match what they're doing, and then you change what you're doing and see if they come with you. She said. And then we moved on. And she came back to the next module and she said, I've got a story to tell you. And she had been in the cell block one night, just as she described, somebody who was drunk, banging on the door, making a noise, shouting to be let out. And she said she was on duty with 2 colleagues. And she said the first one was a very experienced custody sergeant, somebody who works in that environment all the time. And she said he's, kind of big and beefy, and he'd gone and walked down the cell block and shouted at the man and shouted, be quiet. And he was quiet for maybe 30 seconds as the sergeant strode back down to the desk. And then he started banging on the door and yelling again. So she said the other colleague then said, I'll go and sort him out. And she said, this one's really tall and very imposing. And he strode down the cell block and told this man he must be quiet. He went quiet, and the officer walked back down the cell block to the desk. And the man started banging on the door again and shouting. So my sergeant said, I'll go and talk to him, And she's, not very tall, not very big, and she trotted down there. And she said all the way down the block, I was thinking about how do I match his behaviour. So what she did is she banged on the door on the other side, and she shouted at him. And of course, this is where the language patterns come in as well. She shouted at him, if you don't shut up and go to sleep, I won't be able to help you get out of here.
Beautiful.
And he went quiet. She walked back down to the desk. And when she got there, all she could hear was the sound of him snoring. And I just thought that was brilliant because, one of the things I love about teaching NLP is that I give people the tools and I teach them the theory and they practice a bit in class, but everybody goes out into their own world and their own reality. And the thing I love about doing modular training is people keep coming back and telling me what they've done with what they learned. And most people come up with things that I would never have dreamed of. It never in my wildest dreams when I was learning about building rapport and about pacing and leading did I think, oh yeah, you could do this to shut up a drunken prisoner in a police cell. It never ever occurred to me that that would be an application. And it's only the people who work in that environment who would have that idea. So yeah, I learned a lot from working with the police officers, and I have a huge respect for people that do that job. You know, I think I always lived in a world where everyone's a nice person, everybody does their best, and nothing really bad ever happens. And when I worked with the police officers, I discovered that I have the privilege of living in that nice world, because there are people who put uniforms on and stand between me and the people who don't live in that world. And yeah, it was quite a humbling experience, actually, to work with those people and get to know them. And
I have a question for you.
yeah.
I'm curious. If you were asked by somebody who was responsible for educating a lot of police,
Mm-hmm.
how much NLP would they need to make a difference for their work? Would you say that they would all have to be practitioners, or would it be possible to choose a selection, a subset that would make a big difference?
That's a great question. And you know, when we got to the end of the practitioner training, the HR director for the service came to the final day and was asking people about what they'd learned, what they'd got out of it, how useful it was, and so on. And he said, does it really have to be this many days?
Yeah.
And I think we did 16 days altogether, which is actually quite short for me. You know, I normally like to do 20, but no, it was 16 days. And so several of the officers said, oh no, it doesn't need to be this long. You know, we could definitely have done the most useful things in fewer days. So I said, okay, so let's just check this out. So raise your hand if you think that the section that we did on submodalities was the most useful and would definitely benefit everybody else. And about half the hands went up. And I went, okay, raise your hand if you think the section on submodalities wasn't actually that useful and could have been dropped. And about a third of the hands went up. And I tested that with various different sections. And what that really demonstrates is that if you go through a whole practitioner training, everybody will find 5 or 6 areas that they think are really useful and really relevant. And there'll be other areas where they think, okay, that's not so important for me. But it's not the same areas for everyone. And that always obviously comes down to a person's meta programs and rep system preferences and all that kind of thing as to which bits they find most useful.
How were those days split up? Was it 16 days in a row or split up over half a year?
It was 4 lots of 4 days.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Thanks.
It's quite a lot.
Yes, yes, it is. Yeah, I've tended to stick with doing everything in the classroom. I tend not to give people work to do beforehand, because most of the people that I work with are people in positions of responsibility in large organizations. And so they're busy people. And I've always had this sense that it would be nice to say to people, just put the dates in your diary, clear everything else out and show up. And then everybody arrives on the first day, you know, sort of on the same page. Whereas my concern would be if I gave people lots of work to do beforehand and then did fewer days of workshop, is not everybody would have the same amount of time to devote to the pre-course reading and so on. And I therefore couldn't be sure that everybody was on the same page on day one.
Totally agree on that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very good.
So, Christina, do you want to know more about working with the police, or do you want me to move on?
Please move on.
Okay.
You said also that you've been working with the not industry, but let's see what I have. the hospitality industry. What does that mean? Is the machines, or is it nursery?
Hotels, hospitality.
Hospitality.
Yes, yeah. So I have a client who is the HR director of a hotel chain, but she used to work for Legoland.
Mm-hmm.
And she's been a client for about 10 years now, I think. And she's invited me in to work with various different teams that she had charge of. Perhaps one of the most interesting ones that I did is I worked with one of the PR teams at Legoland, and we talked about how they would use language to best effect. And they didn't have a lot of time or budget, so I literally did 2 half-day workshops with them and taught them some basic NLP language skills. And then we did a competition, and we gave them a piece of writing that had been done before they did the training, and then we asked them to rewrite it and gave a prize for the best one. And I was really, really impressed with how well they did, considering how little input they'd had. They kind of took every little bit of value out of the input and put it into practice. And you could look at the work they were doing and the messages they were sending out, for example, on social media, and compare it with their equivalent in other companies, and you could really see the difference in what they were doing. It was a lot of fun.
I see. A question that just came up in me is, what do you think is the most if I ask it in Swedish, maybe Ulf can translate it.
Yes.
Vad är det som gör att hon är det specifika med henne? Vad är det som gör att hon är specifik, att hon är extra duktig i sina utbildningar?
Okay, so Dianne, is there any special ability or skill that or anything about you that makes you stand out from other trainers? When you've been discussing that at the leadership summit, you were discussing different ways of teaching and training. So Christina's wondering, is there anything specific about your way of teaching and training that stood out from the rest?
Not in that context, because I was among a lot of very talented trainers. I think what perhaps makes me a little bit different from some of my contemporaries is my knowledge of NLP kind of sits on top of a degree in traditional psychology. So NLP isn't the only thing I know, in other words. So I draw on a lot of other areas of expertise. But training is what I've been doing since I was 25. You know, I was really lucky. I discovered what I wanted to do with my life when I was very young. And I started learning NLP when I was 29. So when I applied for my master training qualification, the thing that I was asked for is, you know, what is your unique contribution to the field? You know, so have you developed new techniques or whatever? I haven't done anything like that. But what I'm obsessed with is finding better ways to help people learn stuff quickly. So I design exercises and I try them out, and if they don't work, I refine them until they do work, or I throw them away. And I'm just really interested in the whole process of learning. And I like to make sure that the way I run a training program really gets results. So one of my huge areas of market is the IT sector. So I work a lot with people who are senior leaders in the technology sector. So they're CIOs, CTOs, people like that, leadership teams within that arena. And they're all really bright people. You know, really bright. They pick things up like that, which is a delight when you're a trainer and people pick things up quickly. but they're also people who have spent most of their time and energy learning technical stuff. And so at the point that they arrive and they say, I want to learn now about how to deal with the people side of my job, it helps that they're open to learning, but it really is foreign territory for a lot of them. And I think one of the things that I've been able to do there is to put NLP into a context that makes a lot of sense. So it sounds very logical and it's very systematic and procedural, and it appeals to people who have that way of thinking. It wouldn't be as appealing, the way I teach it, to somebody who doesn't have that technical background. So I tend to get a lot of people who work in technology, engineering, finance, law, you know, all those sorts of disciplines that are very technical and require a lot of specialist information. And they want to know that what I'm teaching them has credibility. So I think, going back to your original question, Ulf, I think that's probably the hallmark of my style as a trainer, is that I'm very logical and procedural. You know, I follow the recipes.
I'm interested in I work as a teacher as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So do you have a small model that you refer to in your own head when you speak about learning and teaching?
Mm-hmm.
What is your little map of if you just cook it down to, okay, this is how it's happening, how would you explain that?
Yeah, for me it's a journey, and so it's all the NLP stuff really. It's about saying, where are we starting from and where do we want to get to? And not just in terms of what people know, but in terms of the experience they have during the learning process. So I'm always thinking about what kind of state is somebody in when they arrive, and what state are they in by the time they do the first exercise. And one of the things that I remember early on when I was learning NLP is that there were a couple of chunks of NLP, mostly to do with language, where I was being taught something and then being told to go and do an exercise with it. And I didn't know enough to do the exercise. And so, you know, it was kind of have a go, stumble through, don't achieve anything, don't learn anything, except that I need to go and revisit this for myself. So I always think about, what does somebody already know, and how can we use what they know so that they get a success in an exercise, even if it's a very simple exercise, and then we build up to something more complex. Yeah. So for example, with language, I would start people off just recognizing a pattern and then creating examples of the pattern, and then once they can do that reliably, then thinking about, okay, so how can I use this, and where would I use it? Then, you know, what would be the choice of pattern, and so on. And so, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I hope so.
Good.
For me, it's like opening the right neurons in the brain, like making the right ones, and then just put two and two together, and just make new connections.
Absolutely, yes.
And just how to get the right feeling, and then give the instruction. More or less. Okay, thanks.
Can I pop in with a question?
Okay.
How do you find NLP? I don't know how NLP is sort of accepted in the UK contra Sweden, because here it's not always for me as do leadership trainings and so on. I don't always tell people that we are doing NLP because I put it in other contexts. Do you need to do that in Britain, or is it okay to say we're doing NLP? Is it sort of that known and accepted and so on?
That's a great question, and it has changed over the 20-some years that I've been teaching NLP. there was a time early on when nobody had heard of it, and I spent a lot of time explaining what is NLP. And I got really good at doing that. And then there was a period sort of in the mid-2000s when lots of people knew about NLP, and it had acquired a bit of a bad name. And I did find in some companies that people would say, oh yeah, we know NLP and we don't want it. And which was very disappointing. What I'm finding now is that I seem to be working with a whole generation of people who missed out on that, who've never heard of it, and are coming with an open mind, which is really good. Occasionally, I do still come across someone who says, no, we don't do NLP, or, you know, I've got a colleague who's really anti, or the HR director is really against NLP. And for a while, I would find that quite difficult, but I found a reframe for it that really helped me, which is that if somebody has a bad experience with NLP, then they have a good reason to not want to do anymore. And so if somebody says that to me, I will sometimes say to them, so what was it that happened? What did you discover that made you realize that this was definitely not for you? And occasionally I've had quite a good conversation with somebody that has moved them forward a little bit and made them a little bit more willing to at least allow other people to engage with it. Not always, but occasionally. Yeah. But I think the overall status of NLP in the UK is not great. The clinical establishment is very suspicious of it.
Yeah.
And that is because of the lack of research and so on, or the perceived lack of research. There is actually quite a lot now. There's quite a lot of good stuff that will demonstrate to proper scientific standards that what we do works, which is great. And in fact, there's a page on the NLP Leadership Summit website which gives you links to a lot of papers that are proper scientific papers that have been published about various different elements of NLP. So, you know, if that's something that would be useful, it's worth having a look on there.
Thank you. Perfect.
I'd like to jump back to the original question. How do you actually assess quality of NLP? You must have discussed that quite a lot at the Leadership Summit.
Yes, we have, and we haven't come to a sort of unified view of that at all. You know, it's an ongoing conversation, because one of the things that's quite significant is that people are teaching NLP in different contexts. So if you are teaching NLP to qualified psychotherapists and they're incorporating it into their clinical practice, then the standards would be rather different from someone like me teaching it in the business world. So yeah, it's an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, and I think, because I mean, there's this discussion about research, you know, how would you research NLP with a scientific study? And when it comes to psychological interventions, research will show a very, very thin slice of a very precise situation, which very rarely coincides with real life, to be honest. I mean, I've done a study as well, so I have a little bit of experience of that. So it's not really, when people start talking about what is the scientific proof of this, it's like, why would you look for scientific proof of human intervention? Either it's a qualitative thing. Either people feel that they are getting better results in their work and in their life than they did before they learned this. That, for me, would be the only criteria if somebody actually has had some use.
And for me too. I've never minded really that there wasn't a lot of scientific research, but for some people it's important and it's significant. It has been, in the UK, it's certainly been one of the reasons that has been used to justify ignoring NLP. You know, and I have this notion, if you go back to the sort of mid-1980s, when, for example, John and Richard had produced the phobia model. And you can imagine if you were a clinical psychologist and you'd done you know, many years of training and many years of very closely supervised practice, and you had certain protocols. And, you know, I was taught when I was doing my degree that a phobia would take anything up to a year to work with on the basis of a weekly appointment. So, you know, imagine you're that clinical psychologist, and then NLP practitioner comes into you and says, phobias, yeah, it takes about 40 minutes. You know, I've got this fantastic way of doing it and it's really quick. And, you know, what would you say if you were that clinical psychologist? You know, you would say that can't possibly work. You know, I've got X years of training and you know, and I've never heard of that, therefore it can't be any good. You know, it's human nature, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I suspect that because our founders were people who were a bit anti-establishment, weren't really sort of that keen on cooperating with anybody, I think they probably made it a bit of a virtue not to do any kind of research and any sort of proof that what they were doing was working beyond, you know, the evidence of clients. So I kind of understand how we've got to where we've got, and it's very frustrating at times.
About work, you told us that you have some idea about this lockdown, that most people are locked in, maybe you would say. And first of all, you said you had some ideas about it, and then I have some question about what it does with us.
Mm-hmm.
How does it affect us in long terms?
Yeah.
You, from your perspective, working with and training people NLP, what do you think? Will it change our values, our identity, when we have to whole time have a higher perspective, perspective
Mm-hmm.
for taking care of not only myself and my own money and my own work, but I have to take care of the old people or my neighbors and so on.
Yeah.
Do you think it will affect us in the long term?
I do, yes. I think I would go so far as to say that nothing will ever be the same again. You know, people talk about when we get back to normal, but I don't think we will go back to normal. I think we will go forward to something different. You know, I was talking about this with my team this morning. You know, there's a lot of people who are helping people to work through this by helping them realize that a major change in life circumstances like this triggers off a lot of different emotional responses. It's almost like a grieving process, that now we don't have the life that we're used to, and you know, we're missing some of those elements and finding it hard, and there's uncertainty about the future, which also, you know, triggers a lot of different emotional responses. And I think this will affect everybody in different ways. I don't think we can say everybody will be affected in, you know, come on, we're NLPers, you know, subjectivity. Everybody's going to have their own response to this. But I think one of the things that we can say is that we will be changed by this experience, and our habits will change and our values will change. Our perspective of what's really important to us is going to be different as a result of this. Two members of my team were saying this morning that because they're not busy working, because they're spending a lot of time at home and going out for walks and having a lot of time to think, that it's really started them off thinking about, well, what do I really want my life to be about? And what are the things that matter to me? What are the things I don't mind not having anymore? And what are the things that I really do want to be part of my life? And I think, you know, when you have a lot of time on your own, and then it's almost inevitable those sorts of questions come through. But I also think on a more practical level, what we're doing here, having a conversation via virtual technology, I think a lot of people who are doing this for the first time will be starting to say, well, do I really need to travel into the city so that I can have meetings? Wouldn't it make more sense to stay in my usual office and have meetings, or stay at home and have meetings and use the virtual technology? So I think that what we may find is that when the lockdown is released and the restrictions are taken away, is that people will travel less anyway, because they've got comfortable with using this kind of technology. Now, I would hate to think that my business will become about sitting in front of a screen instead of sitting in front of a room full of people. I really don't want that to happen. I love running workshops, and I really do believe that something different happens when you're all in the same room together and you breathe the same air. But what I am thinking is that as people use the technology more, they'll get more confident with it, and therefore they'll be able to discern, when does the technology work? When is it perfectly okay to do this kind of thing because it achieves the purpose? And what are the situations where the technology really isn't the solution? What are the situations where we do need to get around the table together? We do need to be in the same room. We do need to be able to look each other in the eye properly. And my hope is that everybody will come out of this more discerning about when they can use the technology to communicate and when they don't. As one of my clients said to me, why we really need to be in the room together, and also why we don't. And of course, it's different circumstances need different solutions. And I suspect people are going to come out of this with a different view of who is important in life. My sister's taken to phoning me at least once a week, and we've never really talked on the phone very much. We've always had the sort of relationship of, I'm here if you need me, and if I don't hear from you, I'll assume that everything's fine. And so, we only really talk when there's something important going on in our family life. But and this has entirely come from her, she started phoning me at least once a week, just checking in, are you okay, what's going on? And I'm rather enjoying that, and I think she is too. And I think that's something that we might carry on with, even when we don't have to stay at home all the time in the way that we do at the moment. So I think, as people who practice NLP, we do have something useful to offer the world at this time, because we're more able to manage our emotional states than most people. And we have the advantage of being able to take different perspectives. So, for example, one of the things I did a few weeks ago is I went out into the future and turned around and looked back from the vantage point of December 2020 and thought, well, what do I want to be looking back on in this time? And I realized that I wanted to be able to look back on this time, April, May, however long it lasts, with some fondness. And I wanted to do something where I would be able to feel proud of what I'd achieved and feel that I'd enjoyed my time at home alone. And so hence I wrote my list of projects and things that I wanted to work on. And I've been spending a lot of time writing, and that's something that it's very easy for me not to do under normal circumstances. It's very easy for me to be too busy and be away and distracted by other things. And I've really enjoyed over the last few weeks having whole days where I can just go, okay, I'm just going to sit at my desk and focus and work on the same project for many hours at the same time. And as someone who practices NLP, you have the potential to have conversations with people that aren't necessarily a formal coaching session, but they are you helping people think about their situation in a constructive way. And I think that's that's a real gift that you can give to the people who you care about in this world. And, my mum's 84, and in the beginning she was saying to me, I can't believe I'm going to have to do this for 12 weeks. And I said to her, well, don't think about the 12 weeks. Just take it one day at a time. Just get up in the morning and think, what am I going to do today? And she's following that advice, and she keeps repeating it back to me, and she's telling other people. And, you know, because we know, don't we, if you look at how people organize their timelines, that one of the great stressors is having a through time timeline where you can see everything all out in front of you, and you can see what's coming up, and it can become overwhelming. Whereas when you flip the timeline around the other way, so that you're in the moment and you can't really see the future very clearly and the past's all behind you, then it's much, much easier to let go of the stress as well. So I would never say to my mum, I will turn your timeline around, but I can have that conversation that helps her to do it, you know, without having the sort of process around it. So
that was two good examples for what we can do to help us in this time. The timeline, switch the timeline,
yes.
and go forward a bit forward and look back. Do you have any other examples what you think can be good for us in this time to handle with NLP practice?
Well, I'm a huge believer in the power of the well-formed outcome. And I spend a lot of time teaching people about outcome thinking. And, you know, people do practitioner training with me, and, you know, I go on and on about well-formed outcomes, and they come back and do master practitioner, and I still go on and on about well-formed outcomes, because I think that if you really master the well-formed outcome pattern, it can transform everything in your life. Because I think a lot of people waste a lot of time and energy pursuing outcomes that are not well formed, and then they don't succeed, and they get discouraged, and they've wasted time, and, you know, and they're not focused on the things that they can actually make happen. So I think in this environment where we're all learning how to operate in a different way, we're all having to live our lives in a different way. We've got restrictions on us, we've got different demands, we've got different things that are important. I think just beginning the day with a couple of outcomes can be really, really helpful.
Could you give a practical example of that?
So I usually start the day with 3 outcomes, and at the moment they're usually to do with my work. But for example, one day last week, one of my outcomes was to get some groceries delivered to my mother, because I knew I wasn't going to be able to do it myself last week. And so because I had that in mind, it meant that I spent some time working out the best way to go about that, and drawing on the other resources I had, like my recollections of, you know, the best way to do it. Because getting groceries delivered is not that easy at the moment, as I'm sure you're finding as well. Is, you know, it used to be just an easy thing to do, and now the number of people who want that has gone up dramatically, and so on. So that would be an example of you know, a non-work thing. But I usually start the day with 3 outcomes, and I think if I can get 3 important things done, then I'm going to end the day feeling like it's been a worthwhile day. And if during the day I get a little bit unsettled, you know, I listen to the news or something like that, it gives me something to bring my mind back to focus on, and to think, okay, so I can't do anything about the fact that another however many 100 people have died of this awful disease. What I can do is I can go back to, you know, writing the article I was writing, or you know, whatever it is, and it gives me a sense of purpose, and it gives me a sense of achievement at the end of the day. And these things are all really important for our own well-being, because one of the things that I know, you know, having been self-employed for 20 years and having been through, you know, times when business was not very good, is I know that if I don't use my skills, then I lose confidence in them. And I said this to everybody in my team, and some of them are doing free coaching for this reason, because we talked about it, and we came to the conclusion that if we spent 3 months and we didn't coach anybody at all, then the first time you coach somebody after 3 months, it's going to be a bit of it's going to be a different kind of experience than if you'd done it yesterday. Let's put it like that. And so I think that it's important to keep doing something that reminds you of your own skills and your value. People will get depressed in this scenario if they're not working. You know, it sounds great, doesn't it? Oh, you know, your employer will pay you to stay at home for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, or however long. Don't come to work. You know, and the UK government's put lots of money into this to make sure that people don't lose their jobs. But what I'm seeing is friends posting on Facebook saying they're sitting around in their pajamas, drinking coffee and watching Netflix. Now, if you do that, even for 2 weeks, then that's going to give you a very different sense of who you are. So I think it's important that we exercise our skills one way or another, that we do something that is an affirmation of who we are, rather than doing things that kind of are putting life on hold.
So
does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. So when you told the story about that small police officer, how she used pacing and leading practically to achieve something that the other officers were not able to do, that's a very clear example of how she could use the NLP that she had learned practically in a way that actually made a difference. So for me, that's a case study. And that's a practical application, empirical evidence of NLP being useful.
Yes.
And in my world, I truly, honestly believe that if we want NLP to be more on the map of people to interest themselves in, we don't need actually studies. We need more practical, real-world examples of people just bringing in their stories, saying, I was able to achieve something in my life, my job, my situation, my morning, my outcome, my groceries today. And this was the NLP approach that I used. And this is why it worked. And it becomes so evident. So, you know, a bank of a zillion stories like that from the students would probably inspire me more than understanding how they were taught. Does that make any sense?
Oh, I agree with you completely. I've always been more interested in what do people do with this and how does it help than can we prove that it works. I know it works. I don't need a scientific study to tell me that. And I always say to people, you know, you don't have to take my word for it. You can just have a go, because these are really easy techniques to use. You know, you don't have to invest a lot of time and energy. You can just have a go, and then you'll find out what works for you. Because I think everybody has their own favorite techniques, and you know, we don't all use all the patterns all of the time. I think most people come out of practitioner training with, you know, 5 or 6 favorite techniques that they just keep on using.
Do you think you could unpack how you actually did a well-formed outcome with the groceries rather than just deciding to get the groceries?
Okay, so I think, I need to preface this a little bit because it's, you know, it's kind of obvious, isn't it? So what's your outcome? Outcome is to get a grocery slot. Okay, so, you know, how will you know you've achieved that? Well, you know, I'll have an order, and, you know, I think that the more you focus on your outcomes, the more confident you get about your scope of influence. So I see this quite often in coaching, where I have a relationship with a client over a period of time. So in the early stages, we might have an outcome which is to make a certain thing happen. They're running a project or whatever, and you say, okay, so is this under your control? And the person will say, not really. I need another key person in the business to cooperate with me and support me and put time and energy into it. So then you go, okay, so that's not a well-formed outcome then. Let's go back to this. So let's talk about how you get that person to do what you want them to do. And, you know, so what's your outcome? Their outcome then becomes something like to go and talk to that person about the project and explain what's needed. And, you know, so then it is under their control to go and have that conversation. If the person practices with the well-formed outcomes and does them regularly, what often happens then is that 3 or 4 months down the line, we'll be having a similar conversation, and you know, they'll be talking about a project. You go, okay, so is this something that is under your control? Can you make it happen? Is there anybody else involved? And they'll say to me something like, yeah, I need this other person to get involved. I need them to spend some time and so on. And they'll do that. That's no problem. And so the person's sense of how they can influence others and what needs to happen, it becomes enlarged. And I always say when I'm teaching this, if you're using it in coaching, be open to the client's map of the world as to what is and isn't under their control. So I got to a point many years ago, and I fell off this dizzy height. I'm not quite sure what happened, but I did get to a point some years ago where I completely believed that when I had an outcome, it would happen. And I remember having a conversation with my then PA. We were booking venues for the following year's public courses. And she'd gone and talked to all the venues, and she came back to me and she said, the practitioner training in the autumn, the hotel has got the room that you want for all of the course, except for this one Wednesday in November. And they can't let you have the room because somebody else has got it booked. And I remember looking up from what I was doing and saying to her, oh, just book it, they'll cancel. And they did. and I was so certain of that I never even checked afterwards. And my then PA said to me, you know, she said, how could you know? I said, and I don't really know to this day. But what I do know is that when I focus my intention and I'm really clear about what it is I want to achieve, then it happens in ways that I can't always trace the cause and effect of. And I think that comes with a lot of practice.
Can I just
yeah.
make a comment about that? Because I find that happening all the time as well. It's like the more you get clear of your outcome, the more amazing things tend to happen.
Yes.
That I can't explain. Like you say, I just know that this is going to be solved, or I don't book something because I know it will be cancelled, or I do book something and I know I don't know how to get the money or anything, but I know how I will solve it, or
yes,
the universe solves it, or whatever. But I find that very hard to sort of incorporate into people that are very into their logic minds, to sort of be so specific so you let go. Because I think it's sort of it becomes so how do you say, contradictory, so you can't really believe it.
I wouldn't say this to somebody on day one of a practitioner training, because you know people might think I was a little bit crazy, but I do think that there is more at work here than what we're consciously aware of.
Yeah.
And yeah, my usual explanation is that your sense of what is and isn't under your control will expand, and sometimes it will expand beyond the point of logic and reason.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
An exciting subject in itself. Do you discuss that at the Leadership Summit?
I haven't done so far.
That would be interesting.
It certainly would. Yes. So the Leadership Summit is, said Michael's vision was always, it's about people associating with each other. So a great deal of the value of going to the meetings is just the opportunity to chat with other people. And there is a real value in that. And I realized the first time that I went to a Leadership Summit event, when you're surrounded with people, you know, as we are here, who have some of the same basic ideas, you know, it's almost like, you know, we've all sort of signed up to the presuppositions of NLP and we think in similar ways. It does make the conversation flow more readily. And I find I don't need to sort of explain things and justify the way I'm thinking about things in the way that I might with some of my business colleagues, for example. So yeah, I think having that as a common thread does make for some very meaningful conversations.
I think a counterweight to the Leadership Summit would be a student summit with people who have been trained, who are far more than the trainers, who actually say what they have found useful. That would be extremely interesting.
It would, yes, absolutely.
I have a question. If you are using these 3 outcomes, if you use very easy outcomes, does less satisfaction, or when you accomplish the 3 easy outcomes?
Yes.
Or
Yeah,
is it,
I think there is a bit of an art to that, isn't there, of having outcomes that are meaningful enough that when you get to the end of the day and you've succeeded, that you feel good about it. Yeah, you know, if they were too simple, then yeah, you could just kind of shrug and go, okay, that wasn't
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Isn't that part of gratitude training? I mean, we all know that people are recommending to find 3 things to feel gratitude about every day.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
about finding what it is you actually want as an outcome by looking at what you're actually thankful for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm. I mean, I think it's quite an interesting exercise in itself, just to ask yourself, so, you know, what do I want to have achieved by the end of this day? And that in itself gives us insight into what's important and what's meaningful to us.
Yeah, absolutely. So is there somebody who is, I'm switching view now here so I can see more of you guys at the same. Is there somebody who wants to add a specific question or is wondering about something? Yeah, go ahead, Roger.
Hello, Dianne.
I love your
Being obsessed by procedures and by making teaching so simple that that really comes across.
Mm-hmm.
What's the procedure behind being obsessed by that? How do you do that?
How do I do that? I'm not sure, to be honest with you. I think it's possibly driven by a number of things. One is that I like to be able to replicate what I've done. I spent some of my life working for a training company where I was, my job was to deliver standard training programs. And sometimes we might deliver the program 10 times in the same company, you know, to a whole layer of management, for example. And the training company had, one of its principles was that everybody should have the same experience. So I think that was quite good for me, because it is quite easy for me to get sort of distracted and go off the topic. If somebody asks me an interesting question, and you know, but one of my principles about running a training program is that I like it to be replicable. I like to be able to do the same thing again and get the same results. And so what I do when I design a program is I kind of map out the journey in quite a lot of detail, and I allow a bit of flexibility so that if somebody asks me an interesting question, we have time to explore it. But then I always have a structure to come back to. And I'm a great believer in making things no more difficult than they need to be. And I know people who like to experiment with the NLP procedures. And my view is, we know they work, so why not just use them as they are?
But you still have to explain them to someone. So
yeah.
do you ask people how they felt or what they learned, or do you imagine in your mind what could have gone wrong, or how do you do that?
It's a lot of calibration. So
calibration,
you know, when I'm running a workshop, I'm constantly.
If they look like this.
Everybody's reactions and responses. I tend to work in quite small groups. I wouldn't have more than about 12 people in the room. Okay. So it's quite easy to be aware of what's going on for people. And so I'll pick it up if somebody's not getting something, or something's not making sense, or you know, something hasn't worked, then I always pick that up, and then you know, we can talk about it and I can find out what's going on.
Okay, thanks.
Pleasure.
So I have a key question for you.
Mm-hmm.
If we forget that it's called NLP at this moment,
Mm-hmm.
this tool, how can we use it in the best way possible to change behavior? Because that's what it's good for, isn't it? For allowing people to understand themselves and others and to change behavior. How can we apply NLP globally to change behavior, having this window of opportunity of the corona pandemic, to maybe emerge into that new normal that will be a better normal than the one that created it?
I don't think I have an answer for that. I don't know how we use it globally. I only really know how we use NLP with individuals and small groups. I do think, though, that the more people who use the skills that they have to help themselves and others around them, then the more chance we have of having a positive impact that ripples outwards and affects, you know, a large community. I remember when I was doing my practitioner training way back in the early 90s, I trained with Ian McDermott in London, who is still running courses and is a brilliant trainer. And somebody said to him partway through the practitioner course, you know, do you think I should get my partner to come and do this course? And what Ian said was, I like to think that the fact that you're here doing it means that your close family won't have to. And I thought that was a great response. So I think there's a parallel in our current situation, is those of us that have these skills, if we use them to help the people around us, then they will benefit from it, and they will be more resourceful in the way that they deal with the next layer of people and so on. And so it becomes something positive that ripples out. And if something positive ripples out from every one of you, those ripples at some point will meet each other, I'm sure.
Okay, one of the reasons I'm asking is because we had election here, and like many other countries in the world right now, politics are becoming more and more polarized, and there is more of a extremes in the politics that are probably not good if you're a fan of human rights.
Yeah.
And we were thinking that maybe NLP, maybe the NLP Society, or maybe NLP somehow could be used to help people understand the process of democracy, or to look through the way that the debate is being skewed and people are not thinking critically, because the same thing is happening with the corona pandemic, that there's so much disinformation, which is partly because content is being, complex equivalence is only the beginning of what's going on right now. So
I think we've come full circle, haven't we? We're back to the meta model now. So how do you know that? And how would you know if that wasn't true?
Exactly. So I mean, we are thinking that this is a tool that would be useful, and part of the reason that all this disinformation can be spread is because people they don't even know about the term of complex equivalence, which is part of all of this. So, I mean, we are seriously thinking, could we do anything about this?
Maybe something around, meta model the information and get to the source and find out, you know, does this really mean what I think it means? And to get people to kind of go out to third position and be a little more analytical and critical of the information they're being given, rather than taking everything at face value. But it's not really my field, to be honest with you.
Okay, so we have it's 18 past. We have until 7:30, 6:30 your time, and it would be good if anybody has more questions now, if you speak up. Otherwise, it's because this is Q&A time in a way. But we're also curious if these were the last minutes that you could just transfer your experience and knowledge to us. What would you like for us to bring with us?
I think that NLP is a unique set of tools and is uniquely useful among all the different things that I've learned. And you know, believe me, I've been on a lot of training courses. But I think that sometimes we don't realize the power of what we have. I would encourage you to go back to your notebooks, go back to your course manuals, go back to your favorite books and look at them again in the light of who you are now and what's going on in your life now. And just ask yourself, how can I make use of this information? And can I dig a little bit deeper into some of these techniques? I've been putting together an online learning package. In fact, it's one that I'm recycling. We did it some years ago, and now I'm bringing it back out again. And it's called Use Your NLP, and it's really about kind of getting all the value out of that training that you've done. Because I think what tends to happen, as I said earlier, is you go through a practitioner training and you come out of that with 4 or 5 or 6 favorite techniques that you keep using. And then you go through master practitioner and you come out of that with another 3 or 4 techniques that you really like. And some of the things that in the beginning didn't really resonate with you, you perhaps haven't used and you haven't explored in a lot of detail. But if you go back to them now, you know, you're a different person now than you were when you originally took that training. And you have different concerns and different ways of thinking, your life's in a different place. And so if you go and investigate some of those techniques that were not your favorite, you might find that there's some real value to be had there, and something that will take you forward in a way that you weren't really expecting or imagining. And that would be my recommendation to you. If you find you have a little bit of extra time available to you now because of the way the world is, that would be a great thing to do, is go and revisit some of the learning that you did months, years ago, and see how it looks now.
Well, that's a great advice. Yeah, that happened to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah. Well, actually, to be honest, I mean, when you take the logical levels, for example, of DILTs that are used and referred to a lot, I was never using them a lot. I understood the concept. I wasn't really putting them into real life application. It didn't turn into one of my favorite, go-to.
Yeah.
And then Aldo Civico came here. I don't know if you know who he is. But he has these 7 steps of conflict resolution, where he applied those in a way that was like, oh my God. All of a sudden, it was like, here is something that is useful for me, that and since then I had to go back and look at them 20 more times and found new applications for them, which I now can appreciate in a different way. So I really resonate with that. Beautiful. So 8 minutes left. Anybody has any other questions, remarks, reflections, questions?
Just have a reflection about this spreading sort of the knowledge, and that you're getting ripple effects. Because I think that's an important thing to remember, even more now when we are in a special situation in the world, that every change you make for yourself will affect someone else, and every change you make for someone else will affect another person. So you don't have to change the world to change the world. Just to keep that in mind, because it's easy to sort of end up in, I want to do more, and I'm just talking about myself, of course. Maybe someone will recognize themselves. But just keep sort of your mind on the plus side, that you make difference, you do things. And even if you just do like, oh, what a wonderful flower I saw today, then you notice that and not the catastrophe.
Yes.
So I was really pleased to hear you talking about that.
Yeah.
I don't know how to say it in English. I say thank you.
Thank you.
Nice.
That's good. So I've written down your toolbox, the Corona toolbox, and can I just double check here at the end that I understood it right? So, so basically you said that practical application of this that you've been using in this state of quarantine that we have now is that your tools you mentioned specifically were perspectives, tools we have, controlling our emotional states, things we are able to do, timeline in different ways, thinking about our perspective of it at the moment so that we can turn it in a way that doesn't overwhelm us, but also that you step forward and look back, and you found that you would like to have fondness and be proud of looking back at this period. Now that would work for any period, right? But those are good points. And then you said have well-formed outcomes and remind yourself every day of that. And also you used a wonderful reframing for your mom. So reframing.
I'm sure that you can all think of other applications of your NLP that will help you in this circumstance. You know, whatever it is that you're wrestling with that's difficult and unusual, there will be a tool in the toolbox that's relevant.
So for somebody looking at this now for the first time, they find this webinar and they're going, oh, that sounds all good. Because you said that when somebody comes to your training, that means that hopefully their family won't, or their friends won't have to go to it. Yes. I have experienced that some people in the close circuit of somebody who goes to a training develop NLP allergy, because the person comes back going, ah, with all these tools, and they're going, ah. Anybody can experience that?
Yeah. Yeah, at the end of the first module, I always say to my groups, now, just remember the people you're going home to haven't been here with us, and remember your rapport skills.
Yeah, pace and lead, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. 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 So for anyone who's sort of new to NLP, stumbled across this webinar, I would say that the best way to figure out whether or not it's something that's for you is to have a small experience of it. Find an introductory webinar, an introductory course, go and immerse yourself in it for a day or two, and you'll soon know how it could be useful to you. My belief is it's useful to everybody, but I would say that, wouldn't I? This has been my life really for over 20 years. I've been running my business. I have never met anyone that I thought NLP wouldn't be relevant and useful, because it's just a set of tools about understanding how your mind works and how you can have more control and choice over that. And I can't think of anybody who wouldn't benefit from having a bit more control over what goes on in their head.
Yeah. And join the NLP-Society, of course.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And I guess one of the things that you're able to do is to give people information about the different opportunities available to them in Sweden.
Well, we don't recommend specific trainings at all. People tell them that NLP exists, what it is, what it can do for you. And we also compiled 2 books that have practical applications of NLP in real life, in specific situations, in learning situations, that explains the techniques. And we started by selling them, but now we're actually also giving them to certain areas. So we put them in the hands of people, for example, police and firemen and politicians, so that they get an introduction. And we've found that some of them are actually starting to take trainings after that. So we find that that is a viable way of gaining interest.
Yeah.
And we modeled it from Jehovah's Witnesses. It works.
There's always somebody you can model, isn't there?
Yep. There we go. So, Dianne, it's been an extreme pleasure having you here. Christina, do you want to lavish Dianne with praise?
Yeah, I want. I'm really grateful. Deep in my heart, I'm really grateful for that you wanted to be with us. And it's been a real pleasure to listen to you. And you have so much skill, so much experience, so much knowledge, and you explain it in a way that it's possible to understand, even if my English is not that perfect.
Oh, that's a relief.
And that well, so I'm very grateful. Thank you very, very much.
Yep. If anybody else wants to send some love today, and you can just write it in the chat, she can see that.
No, love.
Okay.
So,
don't know how. What did you?
I just said if anybody doesn't want to speak, if they just want to write something, a thank you, or whatever you want to write in the chat, that's fine as well. We're saving the chat so other people can see it too. Yeah, I'll just speak for myself. It was a grand pleasure. Christina's talked a lot about you. It was great that you could come and that you would spend this time with us.
It's been a pleasure. It's been lovely meeting you all, and to finally see you, Christina, after all the emails we've exchanged over the years. That's a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thank you.
And you
Thank
take care.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So now you get the Swedish applause.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care. Hope to stay in touch. Hope to see you in Sweden soon once the ban is
I hope so too.
Yes,
Thank you very
that would be
much.
great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.